recording, resume my video, and then share my screen. Okay, perfect. Good morning. My name is Charity Stoudenrouse, and I started using Inkits in my own classroom in the 2014-2015 school year. And I really enjoyed using it with my students. And I actually started using it with students who I was extremely lucky. My school had decided to really focus in on what we were calling the inquiry standards, which later became the science half of the science practices. And so we were scoring students using work samples in the first trimester. And then in the second trimester, what we did is we actually gave the students who were not proficient, actually gave them an extra class of science. So it was absolutely amazing to get these kids, have them for their normal science class, and then have them for an extra class period where my entire job was to get them to proficiency in their science practices. So it was like a dream come true, right, for a science teacher to really have that extra time. And in that, what I started to notice is that the kids that I had were all of my kids that did a really good job at copying the other people in their labs, and they didn't even know where to start. And that I had basically realized that one day, and the very next day I met Cam Betts, who is our managing director, and he introduced me to Inkits, and that was at a Oregon State NGSS Adoption Committee meeting. And I met Cam, and I heard about this, and I was like, I need it. I need it. That's what I need, because I knew that I needed to be able to get an individual student's science practices, right? So I needed to be able to have my students go through the phases of inquiry on an individual level and to be able to get assessment data. So I needed students that were not just going to be really good at parroting what their lab partners were going to say, but could actually, create their own hypothesis, who could collect data on their own, make their claim, choose which evidence supported that claim, and then write it up in a claim evidence reasoning format. And so having this created the ability for my students to do a number of these labs to really build these skills on an individual level. And then we were able to end that time period by having them come up with their own investigation from scratch. And I will tell you that these kids who were primarily IEP or ELD or both, that these kids came up with the best science, like quote, science fair type experiments that you've ever seen. There was absolutely no Googling, running to mom and dad and saying, hey, what am I gonna do for my science fair experiment? These kids, after doing all of these labs, all of them had some great ideas as to what kinds of experiments they wanted to do on their own. And so it was really remarkable to see them and be like, okay, I'm only going to change this one thing so that I can see what caused that change. And so I really got some I would say that they were more simple than a lot of the labs that you would see at like a science fair, because they were truly only changing one thing, and they were really following the science practices very, very well. And so my students were able to start running through these labs on their own. So they got to the point where they really knew, okay, I'm going to read my goal, and then I'm going to go into my hypothesis. So I'm going to say, if I increase and after some time, they really got used to, okay, that's my independent variable, so I'm going to put that in there. That's what's going to cause the change. And then the time to the end of the ramp. So that's the dependent variable that I'm going to look at. And then that's going to increase. And so they really got to the point where they could pretty quickly do that hypothesis. And then they would come in here. And I will tell you that when we first started out, the kids were just going crazy, changing anything and everything they can. We have another lab that's fairly similar to this, that's forces and motion on different planetary bodies. And so then the kids can even change the planet. So then they're really going crazy, right? Just making random changes. But it doesn't take very long, especially if you're using Rex the tutor. It doesn't take very long for students to start to get very organized about their about their investigations, and they tend to just focus in on that independent variable, make the changes to their independent variable, and then once they see that they've got their data, then they'll move on to the analyze data section. So one thing that I want you to know right now is that if a student makes an incorrect hypothesis, so the time to the end of the ramp, then which my time to the end of my ramp did increase. But let's say that I had said decrease, and then here I said increase. If I said this does not support my hypothesis at this point, I could still have gotten 100% on my entire lab. So that's something to note with students, is because when students get to the point that they realize that their hypothesis was incorrect, like if they had said decrease right here, when they realize that their hypothesis was incorrect, they often want to start over. So they'll email you and they'll be like, I need to start over. But we don't want them to start over, because good scientists, they make their hypothesis and then they collect their data, and then they either say, yep, this supports my hypothesis, or it refutes my hypothesis. And there's nothing wrong with refuting your hypothesis, because that's part of good science. And
Charity, I kind of
yeah.
remember you saying something about that, depending on whether they start with Rex or if they use the basic tutorial, that they wouldn't get Rex, and
Yep.
then they can go
I
back
was just
to
going to go into that.
Yeah, no, because I know she's going to want to focus on how to actually get her classes up and going and ready to go.
So claim, evidence, and reasoning is the last phase. Okay, so then let's go. Now that you kind of have a feel of what the students are going to go through, let's talk about when we're very first in. If you use Google Classroom, you can come to your settings tab, and you can go to your sign-in information. Make sure you're signed in with Google, particularly if you're using Google Classroom. You can manage your classroom sections if you need to. Like, let's say you assigned one lab to one of your classes, but you didn't assign to all of your classes. You can come here and fix that or attach them to Google. Now, if you're starting from bare scratch, you haven't assigned anything yet, through your assigning process, you're going to have the opportunity to create those classes and do that in a pretty seamless fashion. So that settings tab is only necessary if you didn't do it the way you needed to do it when you assigned it the first time. Okay, so when you're assigning the very first time, I highly recommend starting off with these tutorials. You might be thinking, this is way too simple for my students, or this is not the subject matter that we're covering right now. But each of these tutorials should take, particularly high school students, it should take them 15 minutes, maybe even less. But what it does is it gives you that assessment data. So you're going to be able to see those scores for their hypothesis creation, data collection, analyzing, interpreting, and then claim, evidence, reasoning. For all of these, that claim, evidence, and reasoning is going to be auto-scored for you. So when you do the first tutorial, your students are doing that without Rex, the tutor. So it's just a pure assessment. They're going to go in, they're going to go through, and they're going to complete that. You can decide at that point, you can look at their scores and be like, do I feel like this student is ready to hop onto a premium lab or a topic lab that might be more difficult? Or do I feel like they need to hop into the second tutorial? So the second tutorial is going to have Rex in the hypothesis section only. So Rex is going to ensure that the students create a testable hypothesis, but not that it is correct. He's just going to make sure that it's testable. And then they have no more Rex throughout it. So they can go crazy in data collection, etc. And then you're going to get pure assessment scores for the rest of that. And then when they move into the third tutorial, they're going to have Rex throughout the entire investigation. So again, I highly recommend starting off with a tutorial, and you can move through the entire series if you feel like it's necessary, or maybe it's only necessary with some students and not others. But it's a great way to get students started to see where they're at. And then from there, you can jump into some topic labs. So let's just say that we wanted to go into like energy and air resistance. So when you go to assign energy and air resistance, your students are going to get an introduction, which is just going to introduce them to the topic. They're going to get a pre-test and a post-test that's multiple choice, only if you want them to have that. So if you don't want them to have this pre-test, see, it's just, it's multiple choice. They're looking at pictures, being asked questions. If you feel like your students need this practice, then go ahead and assign it. If you feel like they don't, then that's up to you. It's your decision. And then your students with energy and air resistance, or each of these topic or premium labs, they're going to have 3 or 4 different goals that are focused around different misconceptions that students have. So, for example, here we've got determine how the volume of the ball affects the thermal energy of the system. And so they're going to be able to investigate that and run through the entire investigation there. But they're going to actually work their way through each of these. And when students get to these, uh, it's a lot for a student to do in one sitting. I would recommend that, let's say the student does the intro, the pre-test, if you choose to do that, and they finish the first investigation and then take some sort of break. Even if that break is, hey, I know that you guys are, things are kind of stressful right now, like stand up, walk around, go get yourself a snack or whatever, jog in place, do some jumping jacks, come back and do volume of the ball. I know from doing this in my own classroom that when the students try to do all 3 of these in a row without taking a break, that particularly by the end of the 3rd one, their claim evidence and reasoning is just not very high quality because they're just feeling their brain's just a bit taxed. And their writing is just not as high of quality if they do all of these in a row. So I highly recommend taking a break between each of them. Some teachers even choose to have students do them on different days. So they have students come in and do the intro, the pre-test, and the first investigation, let's just say on Monday. Maybe they do something else on Tuesday, come back and do this one on Wednesday, and then this one on Thursday, along with the post-test. Like they break it up that way. So just recommend you want to get those high quality claim evidence reasoning responses. And they don't do well if they don't have a little bit of a brain break in there somewhere. So from here, we, students can run through any of those topic labs, and then let's run through the assign process. So let's say that I'm going to assign basic tutorial to my students. If I've never used this before, I can put the names in, whatever the names of your classes are. And then at this point, if you use Google Classroom, you can choose your Google classes. And now you have a choice. You can assign it from here and push it out to all of your classes. Right here, I could say, hey, I'm gonna make this due tomorrow, March 27th, and I could actually put in a due date and I could publish it. Or I can choose to just leave it as a draft, not publish it. And then what's going to happen is that I'm going to assign it. And then when I come back to this assigned labs tab, I'm going to have a couple of different options. I can, at any point, I can update and send this to Google Classroom. If it's a draft, right, I just saved it as a draft in Google Classroom. I can go to Google Classroom to my classwork tab, and I can choose my drafts, which is right up at the top, and then I could assign it from Google Classroom to my students, or I can grab the shareable link. So if you use another LMS, or it's also here, you can copy the link. And if you use another LMS, you could easily grab, all of these 4 of these codes for your different classes and send them out so that you have students completing the appropriate class section activity. Okay, so once your students have gotten in, once you've assigned it, you send it out to them via Google Classroom or another LMS or however you're getting information to students. These links are going to send students straight in. If they're logged into Google or Clever, they're going to be able to very, very quickly create their accounts and get started. And it takes them straight into the activity. It's very fast and efficient. If they are not connected to Google or Clever, they're going to need to put in some information. And then it's going to create a username and a password for them, which they should write down because students frequently forget those if they don't write them down. And then students will hop in, they'll start in on the activity. And as soon as they start in, you will be able to see some report data. So your data will actually show up here. You'll be able to see their scores. And then you will have Ink Blotter if you had this open. This is alerts when students are actually working and when they're actually struggling. You would see alerts here. if you had that open, like on a side tab, or, you know, if you have two screens, you could put that on one screen while you're working and you think your students are working. Some teachers I know are keeping almost like office hours during their class period, and so having a Zoom room open or having a Google Hangout open, and students can pop into that when they're struggling. And so it could be very helpful to have that ink blotter open, so that if a student hopped in, you'd be like, oh yeah, you know, I saw that this, and you would have all kinds of information. So in fact, let me go to let me go show you what that would look like. So it's under our preview tab, so you could kind of mess around with it on your own. So the reports, just show you really quickly, all of this data is going to be available to you. So you would be able to see how your students are doing in their claim, or in their hypothesis formation, planning and conducting, analyzing and interpreting, and then their claim evidence reasoning format. So you'd be able to also see their sub-skills. And this populates as they work. So as soon as they're done with the hypothesis formation, those scores populate. And then as soon as they're done with data collection, those scores populate. And then if you wanted to actually go in and see that student's responses, you could click in and actually view them through this paper icon on an individual level. Or if you wanted to, you could download for your entire class. And it's in a spreadsheet, but that allows you to really quickly be able to look through all of the student responses in that manner. Now, if you wanted to see what blotter looks like, this is very helpful. Oh, shoot. Okay, this is very, very helpful if your students are struggling. And here, let me just really quickly go to resources so I can show you. If your students are struggling, this is very, very helpful to be able to look at the alerts. And so here we have some documents that help you see what those alerts look like. And so you would actually have those individual alerts saying, hey, Marcus is struggling with hypothesizing. So then if Marcus contacts you and says, you know, I'm struggling in this spot, be able to be like, oh, and you could see which goal is he on, what's his independent variable, what's his dependent variable, and what mistake did he just make. You would know all of that information as he was contacting you, which is really helpful. You'd be able to see class-wide alerts, so you'd know if all, you know, if a majority of your students are struggling with the same thing. And then you could click in and get more information on each individual student. So that could be really helpful if you're doing office hours and you kind of know about when your students are going to be doing a lab. But again, the reports are going to populate as a student is working. So even if you only have one student that started in, you'll start to get that data. And then as more students hop in, you'll get more and more data. So going back, settings is going to be your friend if you need to link to Google or change your classes, etc. If you want to access these resources, very, very helpful. I suggest sending out this claim evidence reasoning rubric to students so that they know what to write when they get to those sections. A lot of times high school students will be like, I don't need that. And then they start writing. And then they're like, wait a second. And then that's when, like, I've been walking around in classrooms and I've offered it and they almost always say no the first time I offer it. And then I just keep walking around with it in my hand. And by the end of the class period, every kid has it in front of them. So it's just a good idea to just give it to them so that they know what to write in those sections. And then if they're really struggling and like, I don't, because they'll see their scores. Like we give you numbers and we give you those colors, and dark blue means proficient and light blue means approaching proficiency, and orange is that they're struggling, and they will see that in stars. So 3 dark blue stars or 2 light blue stars or 1 orange star, and they might have questions about that. And so we actually also created this science practices rubric. So hypothesis, question formation, collecting data, analyzing, interpreting, and warranting the claim with data. So very helpful information to help students to do well on those sections, and something they can refer to if they got 1 or 2 stars and they're wondering what they need to do to improve their scores. So again, these can be really helpful resources if you have students that are struggling. And then this page can quickly give you a chance to scan and decide, do I want to use the pre and post test for velocity and air resistance, and what exactly are those goals that we're covering in velocity and air resistance. And so you could just quickly look at what those questions are that are covered in that activity. Think that I could go into more detail, but for somebody who has not used the system yet, I don't really want to do that. I suggest attending a later webinar. Next Wednesday, I'll delve into reports more. And then next Thursday, I'm hoping that we could do more of a best practices, like beyond just assigning it and getting started, like long term, how can you utilize Inkits with students?
Patty, I think that this was a great start. I know Susie even agrees that this really provided enough information to kind of get started and, set it up. She and I spoke on the side about, using Clever versus Google Classroom, because at our school we use Clever. So like our students are already in our Clever account or whatever. So likely she'll be probably logging in using the Clever to log in. I do like that, the claims evidence reasoning rubric. I did not use that the first time, and I didn't know it was there. It's a great resource. You're right. Every single student, they're like, I don't need it. and then like when they start to go actually writing it, they're like, I have no idea what to write. So it is so helpful. And I can't even tell you, like I have signs up, like all these signs up in my room with claim evidence reasoning, how to write them, what does it mean, whatever. And every single time it's like, it's like the first time they've ever heard of it. It's amazing.
I know.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So,
and unless you're in the classroom, like you're not going to get that. That's what happens,
Yeah.
And when you're there, you're like, yeah.
Oh, like what we were saying, what was it, earlier this week or last week or whatever about, you could put the information on the board so that the students know when they come in to look at the board to get their questions answered, they're still going to ask you the question. It doesn't, people can know where to look for the right answers. Doesn't matter. They're still going to ask you.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And at some point you have to be like, are they just asking me for that human connection? Do they want to ask?
Yeah. And honestly, that's very true. Like, and a lot of kids just say they're just concerned. And even though the answer is written right there and they know that that's the answer, they just have that need to ask you for that human connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You just want to connect. And that's why I'm so thankful that, that Zoom exists, that Google Hangout exists, that there are possibilities of getting students connected, like we're doing here today, even though I'm sorry, my camera's not working. I cleaned my office, I did my makeup, I'm wearing a nice business shirt and you can't see me. But hopefully your cameras are working better than mine. And it's just, even if that's all you're doing, it's just having a brief connection with your students. Like it can just make such a difference right now for them to feel like they're connecting.
Oh yeah. And also another thing I've noticed about using Inkits, just to let you know, Susie, that, I do this with a couple other like educational games. They kind of view it almost like an educational game. If they struggle through it and they get like frustrated and stuff like that. But the fact that there's this like dinosaur guy, Rex, that comes by and helps them out, and it's very visually appealing and stuff like that, they kind of treat it almost like it is, a game, and they get like really, when they're not getting something right, it's like that, if you mess up in a game, like they need to fix it. So it starts to really hit onto that internal, that self-motivation that's so hard to get them to work on. Usually they're only motivated when you like force them to be motivated, but this kind of it starts with that self-motivation because they feel like they need to finish the assignment.
Yeah, I really enjoy, and I think students kind of enjoy the different things, like for example, if we're doing, waves and thermal energy, like the students really enjoy kind of just playing around with this. I'll just really quickly, like, we're going to change the temperature, and then we're going to change
Charity.
latitude.
You don't have to do all of the different investigations. Like I was looking, the one that you just chose, there's 3 different misconceptions that it goes through.
Yeah.
Let's say you're doing, like, I know Susie teaches chemistry, and so, with some of those, like the thermal energy aspect of it would be great, but maybe not as much the waves. Would she be able to do parts of the investigation without all of it?
So if you're assigning this one, So we have teachers that definitely, you know, have kids do the first one. There's
Mhm.
not a way to like skip. So see, here's
Hmm.
Rex. I just wanted Rex to pop up for you. It's really why I was doing this. So, so Rex is going to pop up and he's telling me that I'm not doing a controlled experiment. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not. And so if I need more help, I can ask, how do I do that? Or I could just say, okay, and I can come back to the standard and then I can actually do it. But I found that kids really like this activity. You know, they might be like, oh, he looks kind of, you know, he looks kind of young or whatever, but they really start to enjoy the fact that they're making, you know, they're making the drum beat and they're making changes to what's happening to these.
High school kids love things that look like they are juvenile and for young kids. I mean, I can't tell you how often I show this video, Amoeba Sisters for my bio classes. That's so middle school or younger. They love it. They love stickers. You know, it's just like, it's sometimes people like you know, they'll be like, it looks a little young for the high school kids. They may not totally buy in right away. I'm like, sometimes I feel like they like the young look to things more than if it something looks like more official. So
Right. Yeah. Like my high school students would go crazy when I pulled out the sidewalk chalk. Like, we're going to go draw cells right now outside. And like going bonkers, right? Like sidewalk
yeah.
chalk drawing cells. Like that's where it's at. Um, okay. So, yeah, this is a great way to just kind of let the kids play around and get started. And Susie, do you have any other questions? I don't.
The most
What?
part, yeah, it doesn't look like she has too many questions. Nope, we're good.
No. Okay, cool. Okay. Well, it was great talking to you. I'm here if you have more questions.
And Susie, you're also welcome to shoot me an email if you have any questions.